Okay, so this is the outline for what we're going to do. As you can see, there's 5 chapter headings, and each chapter heading is a sort of a theoretical construct that you can use for taking apart some of the problems we look at in rigging all the time. And then at the end of each sort of theoretical section, we take it and we apply it practically to a particular area of the body. And so we'll start off with something like spaces, where we're talking about the relationship of hierarchical spaces to each other and how that affects the design of controls. And then we'll take it down to the practical level and we'll look at roots. So I won't bother to read this over. You can see what it says for yourself. But the 5 big heads there, spaces, kinematics, IK controls, switching systems, and coordination, those are things that we're going to keep hitting over and over and over again. Now, in case you've missed the opening slide, all of these are online. The URL will be up again at the end, so you don't have to kill yourself writing things down. So let's go. So let's start off with a question, right? What's a rig? It's sort of like pornography. It's one of these things, you know it when you see it, but it's hard to provide a good definition. But here's my answer. Doug, thanks. Yeah, a rig is a bunch of animations waiting to be born. It's not a posing tool. It's not an interface. It's not a set of like, oh, well, it's really cool because I don't have to use the rotate tool at all. It's a description of a whole bunch of potential animations. It's a bunch of animations that are waiting to come out. And because that's what a rig is, no one rig, as I said before, is really perfect for every job. You're always locking off some possibilities when you make a choice, as well as embracing others. And so a lot of what we're talking about today is figuring out which possibilities to embrace and which to reject on Monday, and then on Tuesday you might have a whole different set of priorities. And so if you have the right framework to take these questions apart, you don't have to go back to the book every time. So if you're curious about this, I used to be a lot more dogmatic about the multiple rigs thing, and there's a talk I gave in 2002, which is going to be up there. It's not up there yet, but you could look at it. You could look at that. So the first concept we're going to look at is spaces. Now, this is something everybody knows, that the simplest way to understand it is the sort of nested transformations that you see in any skeleton or grouping, things like that. The key thing about spaces is that spaces are where motions happen, and finding the right space for the motion is absolutely critical to describing it elegantly and efficiently. Back in the days when people didn't know that planets moved in elliptical orbits, they imagined that they moved in circular orbits, and then to account for what they actually do, they'd add a little circle on top of the big circle, and then another little circle on top of that when the observations got better. If you tried to describe the motion of the moon around the sun, you'd come up with this crazy spirograph shape. If you try to describe the motion of the moon around the Earth, it's very simple. So finding the right space for your controls and finding the right space to discuss things in is absolutely critical to good rigging. So, like we said, spaces are frames of reference. Usually, but not always, they mean local transformation spaces. But managing them is the real key. Making decisions, not just popping controls in because it's easy to pose this way, but putting controls where they want to be to describe the motions that they're going to have to deal with. That's the number one priority. The way you can tell if you haven't done it right is if your animators are counter-animating. Anytime somebody has to set a key with the intention of making it look like he didn't set a key, you have failed at your job. And so that's the number one thing you want to be looking for, is why are people having to do this? Is it just management? Is it making up for my failures? Or are they actually trying to do some art? So one of the things that falls out of this notion of spaces is what I call key scope. And the idea is that since we provide an interface to all this motion for the animators, what we're providing is basically got to be analyzed along the lines of any other interface. You don't want to create keys where, my X translation is happening on a scale of meters, but my Y translation is happening on a trail of kilometers, right? You don't want to have things where, this component is rotating by 5 degrees and this is rotating by hundreds. It's all cyclical. You don't want to have things that cycle and things that don't cycle in the same key set if you can avoid it. And so to find out if your scopes are good, you can just tell by looking at the F-curves, as we'll see in a sec. These two sets of F-curves, the top pair and the bottom one, describe the same motion. It's just a character's hip as it's moving through the world. The difference is that in this one, we're just tracking the world positions or the world positions of the hip. And so, as you can see, I've got keys all over the place. There's some for the up and down bounce of the hips. There's some for the side-to-side sway of the hips. And then the big blue diagonal line, that's the forward motion through the world, and it's also the small hesitation at the beginning and end of each pace. Right? That's why there are a bunch of little keys on there. Now, because I've got this elephant in the room, this enormous big curve that's operating on a scale of meters with all these other things on a scale of centimeters, it's really hard to read. Just, I can't look at all the keys. And I've got what's basically a cyclical phenomenon, which is that, and this, confused with a historical phenomenon that doesn't cycle, which is walking through the world. The bottom set of keys describe exactly the same motion. The only difference is I've taken out that big movement through the world and put it on a different node. And that lets me concentrate on the fact that this is a cyclical motion. And it also lets me concentrate on the fact that it's all happening on the same scale. And then the other thing, the navigation through the world thing, I handle elsewhere where that's appropriate. That's what good keyscope is about. So I said before that keyscope doesn't, or rather spaces don't always have to be physical. Now there's an infinite variety of things we can talk about here, so we can't go too very deep. But basically what I want to argue is that you can make a fake space. You can basically reduce the number of options available to the animator using automation. And so I want to talk a little bit about what's a good time to do that and what's a bad time to do that. The eyeball example up there is a case of something that I regard as a good reason for automation. The way those eyes are set up, there's a fan of 3 bones above the eye and another fan of 3 bones below the eye. And as the eyes rotate around, you just want to move them out of the way. This is actually not the same exact setup, but you can see the same behavior in action, right? There's no expressive power in that. I need to have some other control to do things like squint or blink. But I just need to get them out of the way most of the time. As my gaze shifts around, my eyelids move to keep the pupils clear. That's what eyelids do. So if there's no opportunity for the animator to make a statement, and there's the ripe opportunity for making a mistake in one of those 18 sets of keys that don't mean anything, well, let's get rid of that. Let's automate that. So you automate that. In this case, it was pretty simple with 2 drivers, one that was based on the horizontal movement of the eye and another that was based on the vertical. And then it's just out of your hands, and you add a separate control for the blinks because that's something the animator will care about. So the key here is that what you want to do is take away the opportunity to screw up, but you don't want to do something like some very complicated balancing arrangement that will always keep my weight between my feet. Because, yeah, that's okay when I'm standing, but if I'm running around a corner, that's not where my center of gravity is. So you don't want to do anything that's going to limit the freedom of expression of the animation. You only want to do things that are going to let people concentrate on the cool parts at the expense of the boring stuff. So we're not going to get into too much detail about this, but these are basically the things that the various mechanisms specialize in. For example, if you want to use path animation, that's actually a variant on the trick that I showed you with the hips having the motion on a separate node. Usually, if you set keys in space, and then you want to retime them, the act of retiming them by changing the F-curve handles also changes their motion through space, because you're changing the way they interpolate. So if you care about something like that, you want to use a path animation where you can separate out, this is my exact path through space, from the separate control that says, and this is where I am in time. So it's really handy for that, but for other things, it's kind of cumbersome. Likewise, drivers have a really big, drivers are set-driven keys in Maya, reactors in Max. They have a very great power in that they can coordinate lots of things easily. As you see when we get down to the fingers, fingers are a huge management hassle, and you can use very simple arrangements to just make them simple to deal with when you don't care. But you don't want somebody to be animating playing a piano concerto using this driver arrangement that you made to make it fast. Constraints, the big thing about constraints is they're the sort of inverse of spaces. Constraints are made to do all the math that you didn't have to do to get from one space to another. And so at least as often as actually gluing things to each other in the world, you're going to end up using constraints to translate data from one frame of reference to another. Like I've got a cool expression to do something on my clavicle, but I need to know where my wrist is in the space of the clavicle. Well, I just have a locator parented to the clavicle but constrained to the wrist, and then I read its local translation. So that's what constraints are good for, is translation. And expressions, which get a bad rap because they're kind of slow and awkward to work with, expressions have one specialty: they know about time. You can do all sorts of stuff in expressions, but particularly you can look forward in time or backwards. I'll give you a really good example of that later. Okay. So let's take this down to a practical level. This is the dog simple version of the notion of space analysis. We're going to look at two ways that you could arrange the root of your character. Okay. So here's a basic setup. Now, a lot of people actually still use the base of the skeleton, whatever it happens to be, as the root of the character. But if you think about what I was saying about spaces, that particular piece of bone setup doesn't have any particular meaning. It is a physical location in space, but it doesn't correspond to a dynamic entity because it's not the center of gravity of the character. And it also doesn't correspond to like a frame of reference thing. Like if I wanted to fall backwards from my heel, maybe I'd want to pivot down on the ground. I hardly ever really want a pivot that's located at the base of my spine. So to provide a better pivot place, what we do is we have a node somewhere upstream of the skeleton that represents the center of gravity. Now here's a very extreme example, but think about what it would be like to try to animate that motion, try to get the body to shift its weight under that big ball if you didn't have a pivot in the middle of the ball. That's what the center of gravity does for you. And so the simple rig for a root is just to have a node that represents a center of gravity, and then you have an offset, because of course we all know that when you're acting or when you're just doing acrobatics, you can do things that change your center of gravity. Now the good thing about this is it's great for acrobatics. It's great for anything where you really care about pivoting around the center of mass of the body. Where it stinks is if you have to navigate. If you have to navigate, you end up having to conflate a bunch of things that are there to make you walk, like it's basically the problem that we showed in the keyscope example. So to solve that, you would look at this other rig. This is the rig that drives the good version of the keyscope example, and the secret is it's exactly the same as the one I just showed you, except we agree to treat this thing on the ground as the character's two-dimensional location in space. We still have an offset node, and then the offset node still drives the skeleton, but by establishing the convention that this chevron on the ground represents my 2D position, and that all it's going to do is move me through the world and orient me through the world in yaw, we're able to do a whole bunch of great stuff because we now can completely abstract all those big world space motions from the little body space motions. Plus, it also helps for us game people that that's how your engine, 9 times out of 10, actually sees the character. It's actually often very helpful, rather than using a little chevron as your GUI, to put a box that's the same size as your bounding box. That's what the engine sees anyway, so it helps the animator to visualize what's going to happen if you walk into a wall or something. And so this gives you great scope for navigation, but this one isn't very good if you want to do somersaults or backflips or stuff like that, because it doesn't have an abstraction to represent the center of gravity. So that's a really simple example of space manipulation, and obviously you could actually combine them, right? You could have a center of gravity as a child of the ground shadow and have that drive the offset and have that drive the skeleton. So you could do more, except that you're going to be introducing the possibility of overlapping controls. Did I move forward because he moved my center of gravity, because he moved my ground plane, or because he moved my offset? And that's going to be an endless source of trouble for your animators. And so we'll talk about this later, but you're going to always want to make that kind of thing explicit whenever you can get away with it. Okay? So to quickly recap, I didn't really do the recap, but the recap was spaces, right? Where do things happen? Where's the place where the most efficient description of what I want to do can be made? And that feeds right into the next thing we want to talk about, which is kinematics. Kinematics is what happens in between the keyframes, right? It's the character of the motion as opposed to the frame of reference of the motion. So kinematics is all about a choice of expression, right? So IK is about control and precision. It's about being on target. It is the fencer who really cares about thrust and who really cares about where the point of that sword is. FK is about power coming out from the inside. It's expressive, it's gestural, and it's kind of loose, right? Because it's very hard to coordinate when the endpoint of an FK movement is. If you're doing that, you're doing IK. So do you want to show the little granny there? And these things are not mutually contradictory. They complement each other. It's not a choice of like, what do you like as your control scheme. But Granny here, right, she's doing both at the same time. Her right arm with the sword, that's IK. But her left arm is throwing itself backwards to give her some thrust, and that's FK. So you can easily have two things in the same character or the same animation. And as we'll see when we get to talking about arms, you have to do a whole bunch of work to support that. So one thing I should point out, by the way, if you haven't read Richard Williams, you really, really, really have to. And he talks a lot about a concept called progressive breaks. It's the way that in the old days, the classical animators would achieve a certain feeling of life at 12 frames per second by actually changing the volume of a character. If I swipe my hand in front of the camera, my hand gets bigger and stretches out. Now, that's harder for us to do. We can do it technically, but it introduces all sorts of weird problems for us. His answer, which he used like in Roger Rabbit, he was the director for Roger Rabbit, or the animation director for Roger Rabbit, is what he calls progressive breaks, where you get that same feeling of life by basically cheating the way the motion works. So if I'm a baseball pitcher, what really happens is I do that. My arm is rotating pretty much in sync with my torso, and the whole thing is operating almost as a big rigid unit until it gets out to the end. But if I'm animating that, I want to do this with that whip at the end that really provides the follow-through and the emphasis, makes it look a lot bigger than it is in real life. And so that's the sort of the Richard Williams progressive break. And as you can see from what I just did, it's FK. And so generally speaking, FK is expression, IK is control. Okay. Now, when you're dealing with kinematics, you often find that you have to get from one kinematic system to another. It's a general principle, right? That if I bring in mocap data, then that mocap data in its raw form is all FK, even if the phenomena that it's describing are really IK friendly, like walking on the ground. And if you've ever had to deal with mocap data, Doug will give you a whole lot of detail on this if you have any questions. Being able to turn that FK data back into IK is really important. But also you need to go the other way. And so FK is like the universal reference standard because it's based on the character. Here's the quick way to, or rather it's not the quick way to do it, but this is what falls out of it, which is there are times when you want to act like you've built a constraint or a special attachment into your rig, but you really haven't. The reason I use that little example over there in the corner, that was a guy doing the scene from The Great Dictator, the Charlie Chaplin movie, where Hitler is bouncing the beach ball of the world around. And to sell that, the key thing to sell there is the beach ball. You really have to just create that feeling of effortless weight and kind of beautiful, simple curves. So you really want to isolate that and animate that in isolation. Now, the problem is you also want to be able to have the guy catch it. All well and good. So you think, okay, I'll just constrain his hand to the ball as it comes down, and then I'll let it go. And that's actually okay, except that you might have other things to do with that hand. So in the particular case when I did that, I had two other sets of things I had to do with that hand later on. So I didn't want to layer on a third thing just for the special purpose of the ball. So instead, you use this routine where basically you copy the control, you bake the animation onto that copied control, and then just take the keys out of it and put them into the animation of the control that works and get rid of the duplicate. It's a really simple trick that we're going to use again when we get to IK-FK switching. Okay. So let's take this sort of kinematic thing and take a look at torsos. Now, torsos, you've got two basic choices, right? You have a torso which emphasizes expression. That would be for a cartoony character, and also for a character who's doing sort of violent motion like that picture. And then you have a torso that emphasizes positional constraint, right? Where as I walk around, my body's doing all sorts of very sophisticated stuff to keep me balanced. That's that sort of Renaissance contrapposto thing that I do up here. And so FK and IK are going to translate in spine terms into, Doug, two different rigs, right? If you really care about that orbital motion, the whip, then you care about FK. If you care about keeping your position in space, whether that's to be static, like a runner trying to stay upright, or to be dynamic, like a boxer throwing his torso backwards and forwards, either of those is going to be IK. Well, first let's take a look at the FK rigs. Now, when we think FK, we tend to think the thing we learned in our tutorial, right, where you just draw the skeleton up from the bottom of the spine and then away you go. But that isn't, there's no natural law that says that's where the root of the character has to be. And as we can actually, I should step outside and say, it also could be the way the character is built, but not the way the rig is built. So you might want to have FK kinematics, but not have to be based at the skeleton, at the hips, because there's a lot of counter animation. You can't shift your weight in a traditional bottom-rooted FK skeleton without counter animating the torso against what you did with your hips. On the other hand, if you were to have the FK chain start up in the torso and the chest, and then have it end at the hips, you can very easily shift the weight with no counter animation, and you get the little cha-cha-cha. So, you got that, Doug?
I've got a demo of that.
Yeah.
Show this.
So, this is sort of the same animation flowing from above and flowing from below. And so, the key thing here is that it's not necessarily the only way you want to do this. For example, top-rooted FK is very bad if you have to sit down. Because when you're sitting down, the support structure of your body is flowing up from the hips for real. And so it's really a lot of counter animation to animate a seated or a crawling character that way. On the other hand, if you're standing up like I am, you could do this with FK and it would work very well. Okay. Can we go back one really quick, Doug? Thanks. Yeah. And then the other thing you might want to do, and this is an application of the idea of spaces, is you might want to change the frame of reference of a control without necessarily changing the physical arrangement of the character himself. And so there are a lot of times where, in order to avoid counter animation, you might want to have that chest be relative to the center of gravity, or even to the world, not to whatever its parent in the hierarchy happened to be. And so if you needed to do that IK-ish sort of thing, but had other reasons for requiring an FK skeleton, you could do it by taking a control, putting it in the space of the body, constraining it to the FK skeleton, and then using it to constrain the orientation of the end of the skeleton. Does everybody follow what I just said? This is something we can go into in detail afterwards. But the basic idea is that now the rotations aren't relative to whatever happened to the bone below me. Instead, they're relative to the world. And so they make better sense for a lot of kinds of things. This always happens with heads, but we'll get to that when we talk about heads. So, in general, the thing about FK rotations that really sucks is that because they're serial, each one changes the meaning of the ones that come after. So there's no mathematical way, at least none that I'm aware of, where you could distribute a bunch of rotations in 3 dimensions from one end of a chain to the other. That it's very easy to say, oh, I want to rotate 20 degrees this way and 20 degrees that way, and just split it out between however many bones I've got in my skeleton. Works great. But if it's 20, 20, and 20, it's not going to work. So we have a graphic demo of this, which shows it a lot better than anything I could say. Whoops.
Like a movie?
Yeah. So basically what's happening is as each one changes the meaning of the one that comes after it, you add a positional change, watch the shadow, to the rotational change. The blue one is just a conventional FK arrangement, and although it totally makes intuitive sense as an animator to say, okay, I've bent over and I'm over here, and now I just want to twist my shoulders without moving, you can't do it with a conventional FK rig because you've got to figure out all sorts of weird offsets to the other rotations to make that happen without movement. So we're going to show you how we did this. Okay, so the basic idea is since the problem comes from the fact that you're passing down these changes in frame of reference through the chain, then you just don't pass them down. And so what we're going to do instead is distribute that twist independently of the first 2 degrees of freedom. Okay, Doug? So it's pretty straightforward, right? You just have a conventional FK skeleton, except you agree that you only use 2 degrees of freedom in that skeleton. So you can do this, which is perfectly stable, and you can do that, which is perfectly stable. This is separated. You leave it only on the last joint, and then what you're going to do is build a parallel skeleton. Well, strictly speaking, it's not parallel. It's a bunch of branches. Each bone in the hierarchy has a sibling, which is getting the same local rotations as it is, right? Because it's got the influence of the parent, but it isn't doing anything except twist. And you skin to that instead of skinning to the bone that's actually carrying the information through the hierarchy. And because these guys are not passing down information to each other, they're only passive recipients of that twist, you don't get the same problem. This is always the best thing to do if you have to deal with FK chains of any sort, because otherwise you just end up setting a lot of keys to counteract the way FK works. There's actually an article. Okay, you saw the reference to the article. Again, this stuff's all in the slides. You don't need to write it down. Now, another way you can deal with the same exact problem is you got to figure that when you use spline IK, there's going to have to be some way of dealing with the same issue. So you can leverage the way your package's spline IK works to handle this problem for you. So in this setup, what I did is you have a simple FK skeleton, say it's 3 or 4 joints, and then a spline IK that drives the actual character. And then what you do is you skin that spline IK to the little skeleton you made. And by skinning it, you can deform it. You can make the spine shape you want in 2 dimensions, in 2 degrees of freedom. And you get 2 nice things out of this. First of all, you can coordinate a whole lot of bones. You can say, well, I know I can bend from here, and I can bend from down there, or I can maybe scrunch around, but that's it. So I might have 33 vertebrae in my chest if I'm a fully animated, completely accurate guy. But I only really want 2 or 3 handles on that. So I can have my 2 or 3 handles in the form of the FK skeleton and still drive those 33 bones smoothly using the spline IK. The other thing that, of course, falls out of this is the spline IK has a twist parameter, one at the bottom and one at the top, and you just drive those with expressions or other, it's usually going to be an expression or maybe an SDK, and that will handle doing the twist for you, so you don't have to worry about distributing the twist smoothly over 33 vertebrae. So this animates like FK, but it gives you a bunch of extra goodies. Of course, you might just want to go all the way and use spline IK. Now, a lot of people play with it when they first learn about it, and then they kind of throw up their hands in disgust. Spline IK is really good for one thing, and one thing only, in its raw form, which is, if you're an old art student, you remember about the line of action, the sort of sweeping thing, which is the kind of key to figure drawing, right? It sort of establishes the pose and cements the character into the scene. And spline IK is, of course, a perfectly naturalistic way of capturing that, right? Because it's all about manipulating a line. That's the good thing. The bad thing is that if you just take the default one that you get out of the package, how are you actually posing this character? You're moving, say, 6 or 8 or 10 individual control vertices or CVs in 3-dimensional space in order to do one thing. So you're setting as many as maybe 30 keys for each pose, and none of those keys has an independent meaning. It's lousy scope. It's also very awkward to work with because it's easier to make a mistake than it is to do the right thing. And so there are a couple of tricks you can use to tame this a little bit. One thing that people really dislike about spline IK is that because it's based on the tangents that run along the curve, at the ends it's kind of squirrely. That if your bottom bone doesn't have enough CVs above it, or your top bone has too few below it, you're going to position the character and find that the hips or the shoulders have actually changed their orientation, like this guy on the left. The only way you can get around that is to exploit the way splines work for a typical NURBS curve. If you want to make sure you can lock that tangent at the end, you just need to have 4 CVs in a row that are linear, and then the line between them becomes the tangent at the out point. And so if you've got the group of 4 CVs together at the bottom or at the top, you can lock the control to the best of your ability. Now, it isn't going to work entirely if you have bones that are too long. If that group is too small and it falls inside the bone, well, it's the end of the bone that's deciding where to go. So it's still not perfect, particularly if you scrunch down and shorten the entire curve of the spine. However, this is a lot easier to manage. And if you're working in Maya, you can also kind of smooth it out a little bit. This will sometimes develop that S curve with a hitch in it, and that'll tend to create pops and snaps. And so you always want to avoid those kind of things. And so a lot of times I'll just run a procedural smooth on the curve after it's been posed, and then maybe have a parameter for turning that smoothness up or turning it down. So here's that principle put into action. This sort of setup was pretty much derived from something that Michael Isner did at Soft Image. And the basic idea is that you're doing the same trick we said in the FKIK. You're using skins to deform the NURBS curve that drives the skeleton. You could actually use clusters or FFDs or whatever deformation tool you like. The gimmick, though, is that you want to make sure that those knots of 4 CVs at the top and the bottom stay together. And as long as they stay together, you can not only move them, you can rotate them. And that gives you a kind of hybrid functionality between the precise pose control of IK splines and at the same time something more like FK behavior. Plus, it's much better scope because you've only got 2 objects to control, and all the keys have kind of self-evident meanings. If I twist that Y rotation around, well, it just twists him a little bit more. If I move him back and forth, it's actually moving him. It's not translating by some weird nonlinear thing into the actual pose of the character. So this isn't the greatest example in the world of this, but you can get more or less the same poses out of this as you could with FK. You can always get the same poses out of any rig. The difference is, if you look at the guy on the left, he's just doing a straight roll. It's just distributing that twist up and down his spine. The guy on the right is throwing his chest down. That's what the control boxes are doing. And so you're getting a very different kind of snap and unroll. He's really using the positional component of his chest rather than just the flap. Now, like I said, this isn't the best example of what the Isner is great at. But you can do these kind of shimmy motions, which are almost impossible to do in a traditional FK arrangement. You can also get a beautiful kind of automatic counter animation, because as you do all the stuff that's involved in locomoting through the world, you know, your hips are going up and down, you're lifting your leg on the upside and dropping it on the downside, and you're counteracting that with your torso, right? And there's the classic animator's C and reverse C that you're always doing with your body, and all that stuff flows very naturally out of this arrangement. Okay? So to quickly recap, we talked a lot about kinematics. And you always want to be aware of the kind of motion you're trying to capture, as well as the space in which that motion's happening. And then we took that as a sort of an example, and we put it on to spines, where you may want the expressive power of FK. You may want to really whip through that motion, or you may want the precision and the control of IK, and so you may want to have the sort of neat automatic balancing behavior that you get out of an Isner. Okay? So let's take a look forward at IK controls. IK controls is sort of an awkward way of describing the thing I mean here. Basically what I'm saying is we all know how IK works now, but you can modify the behavior of any control setup, and particularly of IK, by the way you group it around. In the short version, you can basically make extra pivots for your IK control using manipulation of spaces and other grouping tricks. So the reason I use this is because the classic example for this is feet, and we're going to apply this to feet at the end. A woman in high heels does not walk like a woman in flats. Neither of them walks like a person on bare feet. The skeletal arrangement, the internal skeletal arrangement, is identical. But because you pivot around the thing that hits the ground, that high heel, that low heel, or that biological heel, and the toe behavior is also different for the same reason, they're completely different in character. Okay. So control groups are basically a way of trying to get your scope under control, because it doesn't make sense to want to move something and then rotate something else to deal with the hand, which to the animator's eye is one thing. Likewise, you don't want to have to move a foot and then rotate something else to make that foot rotate. So part of it's just about centralization. But the other thing it's about is modifying the behavior. Pivots have a great deal to say about how a control behaves, and they don't have to just coincide with the joints of the skeleton. For example, watch what I'm doing. Can you see how my wrist pops up and down? I'm not making any special effort to do that because of my demonstration here. I'm pivoting around that, not around that. And that's just how it works. Actually, do you want to show the foot example now, Doug? Since the way we're rolling. And feet are even worse for this, as we're going to see in a second. There you go. So what's going on with that foot is being driven by the position of the pivot, the little red ball. And so you get very different motions out of the same set of keys that, say, go up and down so many degrees. Okay. So on the practical side, there's two things you can do in most cases when you're making a control group. You can either opt for precision, again, like IK, or you can opt for... this is inverted. You can opt for precision in the sense that you can say, I want to specify exactly where that foot is pointing. Or you can opt for a kind of quasi-biological behavior where you say, well, I know his foot is trying to be at this place. What's the good way to do that? So if you have two IKs to do your control group, if you IK, say, hip to ankle, ankle to ball of foot, what you get if you pull out into hyperextension past the range of the IK is this nice naturalistic pointing behavior. And as you come back into regular extension, you sort of do a nice automatic shock absorbing thing. That's great. The downside to that, of course, is that the meaning of the keys on the foot rotation will change if the foot translation is out of range. And so you might opt for greater precision and control by just orient constraining the foot bone directly to the control. And what you want to do depends on style and also depends on your animator. But here's a good example of how you can take control groups to the next level by thinking about how moving things together in unison changes the way the conventional control rig behaves. What we've done here is very simple. All we did is we made the control group include the pole vector for the arm as well as the IK for the arm. And then by making sure that it pivots at a distance from the IK target that's the same length as your forearm, you can have an IK control that still lets you do this. And even better, it lets you do that. Because that's an extremely difficult motion to get any other way. You could actually have two independent IKs, but then you're managing two sets of positions, and it's very, very hard to get the acceleration that you want on two separate things at the same time. On the other hand, if you need to do that to somebody, well, it's great to be able to just grab one control and go whoop, and that's it. This is also the way you want to handle crawling. You could do the same thing for knees. Now, it's not perfect, of course. It suffers from the same limitation as any IK. It's not going to force your character to actually go where the control is. But at the very least, it gives you the ability, just by manipulating groups, to get some very nice behavior really cheaply. Obviously, it's not a good general purpose rig, but it is fine for the particular limited purposes. Kind of raises the question of pole vectors. I want to zip through this really quickly. A pole vector, for those of you who don't know the math underneath it, whenever I want to do an IK solution, there are an infinite number of good solutions. That I could be like this to get my wrist and my shoulder that way. I could be like that, or I could be like this. And the pole vector is basically, rather than trying to come up with some magical way to do this the right way, the pole vector says, all right, just make the animator spec it. Now, the good thing about that is it gives you control. The bad thing about it is it also introduces two kinds of errors. It introduces an error in that you could move the pole vector into the wrong place and cause the arm to flip out. It also introduces the fact that you're controlling what's basically a rotational function. You're really controlling twist in the sense that we had it with FK chains. I mean, you're using positional inputs to do that rather than rotational ones. If you only had a stable frame of reference, you'd want to drive it with rotations for real. So in case you don't know, there's that problem with pole vectors where as the vector approaches the vector of the IK, or the inverse of the vector of the IK, as long as it's on that line, the IK is going to flip out. And the only thing you can do is move it out of the way. So when you're dealing with pole vectors, Doug? Yeah, so when you're working with pole vectors, there's a couple of things to exploit, and they're also the things you have to watch out for. Where do the pole vectors live? If you want to put the pole vectors in one space, they're going to behave differently from another. And the other thing you can exploit is that kind of quasi-IK behavior, as long as you use the group. So there are a couple of things you can do up here, but I want to jump past this slide to the next one, just because this is a little more practical. The typical leg setup, because your foot and your ankle and your knee are usually coordinated, well, the odds are pretty good you're going to want the pole vector to be in the space of the foot. Then it means at least that the frame of reference for your pole vector is always going to be consistent with what your leg's doing. On the other hand, if you're going to be doing arms, you probably do not want the pole vector to be in the space of the hand. If you do, you're going to get behavior like we did with that control group. The only difference is that you're going to have all sorts of tasks for that hand to do, and different things are appropriate for different stuff. I'll show you a rig much later in the talk, which uses this sort of high and tight arrangement where a guy is carrying a gun. And when you're doing a gun, you care about the stable support triangle of gun and shoulder and hands. And so in that case, the pole vectors want to live in the space of the torso, because you don't want that to change as you track around. On the other hand, if I'm walking, well, then I probably just want to leave those pole vectors attached to my center of gravity out behind me, so I don't have constantly changing frames of reference as I go through my cycle. Now, a couple of little tricks there. I think that's mostly for people reading the slides in the future. Okay?
Actually, let me show you this.
Oh, yeah, that's right. There's a thing about pole vector behavior you've got to remember, too, which is that like anything else that uses position to drive a rotation, you often get this weird mismatch between the nature of the behavior and the size of the control input that you have to do. And so on the left, I'm using pole vectors to drive the knees, and on the right, I'm doing the same motion with the twist parameter in the IK. The only real rule about using the twist versus the IK thing is never let them overlap. That's the really important thing. You don't want to do both, or you can never take it apart again. And then you're only going to really want to use it in situations where the limb you're controlling is not very mobile. Now, typically that means you can do it for legs and not for arms. But if you had a character driving a car and you knew his hands were going to be IK'd to the wheel, then you could use twist because you know that the basic frame of reference isn't changing. Okay? So we're going to take a break pretty soon. How are we doing for time, by the way, CAs?
Good.
Are we right on it?
5 minutes ahead.
Excellent. Okay. So we've covered 3 big concepts in this half. We talked about spaces, which is where things live, and it's what things are relative to. And that's like the Uber concept that everything else falls out of. You always want to have the right space to describe the motion in, because if you don't, you're just making people do unnecessary grunt work for no gains. We talked about kinematics, which is what happens inside the space in between the keys. And I strongly want to argue that what happens between the keys is a hell of a lot more important than saving yourself a few seconds when you pose. Now, it's true because you can achieve any pose with any rig, but you cannot achieve any intermediate motion with any rig. And then the last thing we talked about was control groups. And I didn't develop this point as much as I should have, but the basic thing you can do with control groups is you can create an alternative skeleton. Effectively, you can say, I want this thing to pivot from here. I want this thing to depend on this other thing. When we come back from the break, we're going to look at feet, in particular, the classic reverse foot arrangement, which is that in action. It's showing you how to make the foot behave as though it pivoted from one place, when in fact it's, of course, just attached to your body at the ankle.
Going again?
Okay. All right, well, we'll start rolling. Luckily, the first few slides are vaguely duplicative. So if people come in 2 or 3 slides late, they're not missing anything super duper radical. So, as I said, the practical application for this talk about, everybody? Okay. The practical application for the talk about control groups is feet. Because feet are one of the places where you really care a lot about these sort of shifting pivot relationships. So the IK to FK choice in the case of legs is usually simple. If you're not swimming or flying or maybe doing some sort of praying mantis kung fu, you probably just want IK legs. But it's the arrangement of the IK as it hits the foot that really is problematic. So typically, if you're on the ground, if your basic frame of reference is a static, or not a static position, but if your basic frame of reference is a standing person, you can get away with a really simple arrangement where it's just a control box and you either double IK or orient constrain the foot. And that's all you need, as long as you're careful to make sure that pivot is on the ground under the ball of the foot where it should be and not glued to the ankle because that's where the skeleton was. So, yeah, you want to show the old... Yeah. So the feet can do a bunch of different stuff. When they're in the air, they pivot from the ankle. When they're on the ground, they can pivot from the heel. They can twist around the ball of the foot, and then they can also pivot off the toe or off the ball of the foot when they come up. And so if you're a kind of hardcore Maya guy, you can do the animated pivot trick that was in that slide. Problem with that is, and like all forms of pivot animation, you're changing the frame of reference for the thing you're describing when you move the pivot, right? And so if you do the pivot animation like I did it in that slide, it's fine because you're changing the frame of reference but only along the axis of the foot, and so it doesn't cause the foot to move. If I had pulled that off axis at all, moving the pivot around would cause the foot to shift up and down because the place around which my other rotations were happening had also moved. And so we're going to talk a little bit about a rig that's supposed to help work on that, but it's kind of an experimental thing that I'm fiddling with, so I can't guarantee it works. The general solution for the problem of how you get feet to interact properly with the ground and do the right thing is the reverse foot. This has been around for 10 years at least. And the basic idea is pretty simple. You're going to use a nested set of transformations to provide the pivots that you need to do the good heel and toe animation. It's pretty straightforward. It also has some radical flaws. The biggest single thing about this is that it's got overlaps. You could be rotating the foot from the heel or from the ankle or from the toe or whatever. And it's hard just by looking at the foot to know which one caused that. As a secondary thing, you have to worry about takeoff hitches because you're only faking the existence of these multiple pivots. And at some point, you have to transition back to one of them as your kind of basic reference. And so when you take off, you tend to be flipping that toe under the ground or maybe digging it up into the air. But we'll take a look at a couple of these just to give you a sense of the variety of them. Theoretically, the variety is infinite. The simplest version would be just to have two bones, one for the heel and one for the ball of the foot. So typically people will do the heel as the parent because the heel is the thing that you want to place when you dip that foot down on the ground. And so you rotate down from the heel to get yourself flat, and then you want to be able to rotate up from the ball of the foot to get the pronation that brings your foot up off the ground. And so the way this one's arranged, you have a heel, its child is the metatarsal. The metatarsal's child is the IK, so that you can rotate it around either that heel pivot or the ground pivot. And then the toe is a child of the heel, a sibling of the metatarsal. That way, you can rotate you can flex the foot up while keeping the toe on the ground. In this arrangement, you can't lever off the toe very easily. So this is okay for traditional walks and runs. It wouldn't be very appropriate if you wanted to do some real like hardcore basketball or jumping, long jumping, the kind of thing where you're really digging every last fraction of traction out of the ground. Okay?
Got it.
All right. Okay, so now the other big disadvantage of the system I just showed you is because the root pivot there is the heel. If you were to twist the foot on the ground, you'd be twisting around the heel, not where you should be at the ball of the foot. Now, I could have solved that question by rearranging the way the toes were so that you could also twist from the ball of the foot. The problem with that would be that then you have to set a bunch of keys on the toes that you don't necessarily care about to counter-animate against what the lift does. So in this setup, what I did instead is you put the heel at the top, then you have basically a twist-only node which lives under the ball of the foot, so you can do this kind of thing on the ground. You can orient your foot and move it around. And then under that, you've got the metatarsal and the toe arrangements. And so this is a little better for things that have ground contact. It still suffers from all the classic reverse foot problems, which is, okay, I've got four things driving the motion of one thing, or maybe, I guess, two, if you really count the foot as being a hinged thing. And so there's control overlap issues, and there's interface issues. How do I select the exact one of these that I want? Now, yeah, I can have a GUI for that. I can have a selection proxy. We'll talk about those later. But in general, it's a perfectly effective and sort of irritatingly inelegant way to deal with this. So when I was working through this, and I was trying to think of a good example for some of the analytical things we talked about today, I was trying to see, well, how can we work out some of the problems with this without completely doing something that was so off-the-charts complex that we couldn't describe it in a slide. And what I wanted to try to do was to get rid of the redundancy in a typical reverse foot without getting rid of the basic functionality, and also while simplifying the interface. So using the sort of things we talked about, particularly the concepts of scope and of spaces, I thought it through and I said, well, what we really care about is there's foot placement and there's foot elevation. So let's see if we could just get those to be the controls we're dealing with and let everything else go hang. So the way I'm trying to do it here, and I have to say I haven't tested this much in practice. I know it works, but I haven't really lived with it long enough to tell you much about its virtues, right? Is that you've got a single control for the foot, pivots around the ankle because it's going to be the thing you move or not around the ankle, sorry, around the ball because it's the thing you move in the world on the ground. And it's elevation degree, which I don't know if I pointed it out in here, but really should be the first Euler term when you're rotating it. The elevation degree is canceled out by its child. So that if I try to rotate it up, it doesn't appear to move. Instead, or rather its children don't move. It rotates up, but its child rotates down the same amount. And so the original things stay in their relative locations. So the heel is always behind the ground pivot. The ball is always right on the ground pivot. The toe is always in front of it. And the ankle is always above. And then you slave all of their elevation rotations to the original one. You can see the hierarchy up here. And that way, I can just say foot is up, or rather, foot is tilted up, foot is flat, foot is down by animating the one control. And then I have a separate control to say which of these guys is driving it. And that's where things get interesting. Because that part's pretty simple. I think most people could do that automatically. The big issue here is how do you control it in a nice, smooth, elegant way? And the thing is, when you're passing the control back and forth, you have to be able to, you don't know in advance whether that's always going to be heel, ball, toe, ankle, heel, ball, toe, ankle in series. Sometimes it might not be. You might start to take a step and cancel it and go backwards. And so you need to have a control to let you get to any of those without it having to be 4 individual controls or one control with some weird value that says, oh, use this one now and use that one now. I've actually got a control that does that. We'll show you that later. But this one, the reason it's broken out into 2 parameters is because with 2 parameters, you have a really easy interface choice. By splitting it out into ground and air and then front and back, you have 2 relatively significant axes to play with. The significant axes in this case are ground means am I using that thing to support my weight? And then front and back is just am I behind the foot or am I ahead of the foot? And so they cycle together in a typical walk. I'm in the air in the back. That's the ankle. I'm on the ground at the back. That's the heel. I'm on the ground in the front. That's the ball. I'm in the air on the toe. Because at that point, by the time I'm up on my toe, I'm not using that foot for support. I'm just getting that last little kick as I walk away. Now, that's, of course, an assumption, which might not be valid for all animations, but it's a useful trick. And the other nice thing about this is because it's a 2-axis solution, it works really neatly with one of those joystick controls. If you have not read Jason Osipa's book, you really should. It's mostly about facial animation, but he's just a really clever guy. And so what you do there is you have a little box with a control inside it, and the control moves in 2 dimensions, and those 2 dimensions are the 2 dimensions of the control of the thing here. So to quickly recap what we did before the break, we were talking about IK control groups and how IK control groups, you're modifying the behavior of the end of your chain by moving the pivots around, by nesting groups, maybe by changing what group to what. For example, having a bicycle riding guy who has a bicycle control that just rotates his feet. Instead of constraining the feet to the pedals, you might have a bicycle rotator control, which you could pedal with for a while, and everybody's parented to that. Then you just freeze it at the end of the animation, and you can just take the feet out of the pedals and walk away. And as long as you know you're not going to move the bicycle anymore, that would work too. Very special purpose, but it would work. Okay, so the thing we just did, though, points out a very interesting problem. It's not super duper hard to find the combination of spaces and pivots and kinematic arrangements that will describe what you want. But typically what ends up happening is you want a lot of things, and you have to be able to choose between these lots of things. And that's where switching systems come in. The big thing about switching systems is you have to reduce the ambiguity. Typically a constraint arrangement will say, okay, you can dial the weight up over here, dial the weight down over there. Well, that's okay, except that what I really care about, like here, is am I running or am I being flipped by the pole? That's what I care about. I do not want to independently control the weight of the pole vector or the weight of the pole vault thing and the weight of the running guy. And so you might be able to do this with a faking situation, but you're going to have to figure out whether the action is intrinsic to the design of the rig or it's just an accident of the way the scene works out. And the general things you want to worry about when you're trying to figure out if the time and hassle of arranging a switching system are worth it, is you want to figure out, well, is anything being carried over across that transition? In the case of the pole vaulter, it's momentum that's being carried over. And you wouldn't want to just substitute a faker kind of arrangement there, because if you did that, then retiming it, changing the speed with which he approaches the pole vault, or changing the spring in the pole vault itself, would mean you had to go back and refake the other half. You could also worry about when you're conserving intention. Like if I walk along with my arms in FK space and I see a friend and I go to shake hands with him, well, at some point in here I've transitioned from letting my arm dangle to sending my arm out. That transition means something because it reflects what the character's thinking. And so when you're transitioning between spaces or between kinematics because the character is changing their mind about what to do, that's a meaningful interval, and you probably want to preserve it. And the last thing, of course, is when the things can interact with each other, because then you have to figure out, well, maybe I'm going to have to do some pretty complicated stuff, and I need to keep it all here for coordination purposes. So the other thing is, on the other hand, when the interaction is super duper complicated, like the thing we were talking about before with during the break, we were discussing somebody getting in and out of a rocking chair, where effectively you end up having two complete copies of the character, one in the rocking chair and one outside, and switching between them with a big constraint. That's such a one-off kind of thing that you wouldn't build that into the rig. Do we have that one, Doug? I think we do. Is Granny sit down, maybe?
Nope.
We didn't bring it. Dang. Okay. So we're going to take a look at switches sort of considered generically. The simple one is just the basic constraint switch. And all this is doing, really, is substituting one control for two. You know, I could be constrained to my head. I could be constrained to my pocket. And I want to switch between them. And I don't want to have to say, OK, set a key on head constraint weight, set a key on pocket constraint weight. I just want to say head to pocket. And all that is 1, or is n and 1 minus n on the weights. So I don't need to go into this. It's pretty straightforward. I would say, however, that it is an excellent candidate for scripting. It's something you do day in, day out if you do any rigging at all. So even if you're just beginning out in scripting, it's the kind of thing you could set up really easily, and you should get in the habit of doing easily. Okay? What gets interesting is when you need to do multiple targets, like the example here of Tarzan swinging from vine to vine to vine. Now, you could have 10 targets and have Tarzan sort of manually latching onto all of them one at a time. What's a lot easier for those generic sorts of situations is I've got my local target, probably. I've got a body space IK that represents my hand when I'm flying through the air, not attached to anything. And then I've got another target which represents whichever vine is active. And then my real hand is constrained between the body space IK and the whatever vine is active IK. And then I just need to be able to say, OK, at this time it's this vine, at this other time it's that vine. So it's pretty straightforward in this case, right? Because I know that they are serial, all I have to do is say, well, when I'm at 1.0, I'm on vine 1. I'm at 1.5, I'm halfway between 1 and 2. When I'm at 2, I'm at vine 2, and so on. And so that's pretty straightforward. It's got good key scope, but it's limited to serial applications. Because if I wanted to jump backwards from 2 to 0, well, halfway between those is 1. But maybe I don't want to be there when I'm halfway back, right? So in that case, you got to go for a slightly more complicated arrangement. And this would be another way to handle the thing that I pointed out, the thing that I was talking about with the multiple pivot foot arrangement. If you wanted to be able to have basically random access to any number of a bunch of different controls, you're going to have to basically kind of cheat the way the F-curves work in the package. And so I'm leveraging the power of expressions to look forward and backwards in time here. What basically happens is at any given evaluation, the expression looks forward to, well, what's the next integer keyframe that he set? And it looks backwards to what's the last integer keyframe he set. Those integer keys are the indexes of the targets. So if I'm at 1.0, well, I know I'm at footstep 1. But if I'm at 1.5, I'm somewhere between footstep 1 and whatever the next keyframe guy is. So like here, in this interval here, I'm going from footstep 1 to footstep 2, and there's no footstep 0 to footstep 2, and there's no footstep 1 involved. So the thing about this that's bad is that the F-curve value is no longer linearly mapped onto what's going on. The thing that's good about this is that to do the arrangement that I have here, where I've got whatever it is, 5 or 4 of these guys, I had to have 4 F-curves and 19 keys. And I could do the same exact thing with 1 F-curve and 7 keys. The only timing control you have in this arrangement is tangents, because you can't set that little extra nugget of 1.1 to kind of hold yourself back. But if you're used to working with tangents, this really simplifies a lot of kind of multiple scheduling arrangements. It's really good for footstep systems, which themselves basically are only really useful for doing, like what I'm doing up here. I wouldn't use footsteps to like walk all the way across the room. But when you're shifting weight and balancing around and you care about particular marks, you have an actor who wants to come to a particular place and deliver his soliloquy, that's a footsteppy kind of thing because you want to be able to time it independently of placing it. So that's constraint switching, and those are the general mechanisms for sort of passing off, I want to drive the rotation with this or the orientation with that. FKIK is its own little thing. The interesting thing about FKIK is it's not really very complicated. It seems like rocket science, but really all they're doing inside the package is they've got a copy of the arm driven by IK, another copy driven by FK, and then they're just blending the joint rotations by whatever your IK to FK parameter is. And so that's not hard. We can do that, right? The only thing that's tricky about it is that if you don't have matched keys in both frames of reference, you're going to get weird things happening when you try to do the transition. So if I'm going from this pose in FK to that pose in IK, I also need this in IK and that in FK. Everybody follow what I'm saying? That you need to have both sets of keys in both frames of reference. Otherwise, the transition might have all sorts of weird stuff. There may just be this leftover IK key way back there. And as I start transitioning, my hand goes whoop, because I've got an IK key back there that's homing in on this position while I'm homing in on it in IK to FK space. And so before we get on to the actual details of how you can get around that, you might want to consider just punting. You could do exactly what I said. You could have two copies of the skeleton, an IK skeleton and an FK skeleton, or an IK arm and an FK arm, yada, yada. This has some distinct advantages, not the least of which is that there's no ambiguity at all for the animator. It's always clear what the FK is doing and what the IK is doing, and getting back and forth between them is then completely self-explanatory. Now, of course, it's kind of cluttered and inelegant, but it is very powerful because it can't go wrong. So that's one way you could do it. Alternatively, you could go even like another notch down from that in terms of complexity and basically just fake it. You could stick an extra node, say, up at the shoulder that's a parent of your hand IK, and you can just rotate that node, causing the hand IK to move. You can even get a little bit of that thing that your arm does, where as you're going down and accelerating, it relaxes a little bit, and then as you're coming up, it gets narrower by locally translating towards the inside and outside of, or towards the inside of that space, right? That's just extending in the space while the space itself is rotating. Now, obviously, that's a very limited application thing, although I've got a good example of where it can be useful coming up. But it's just another example of how, if you know the effect you want to achieve, you can sometimes cheat. And as long as you didn't end up having the overlap, which would involve like, well, am I up here because I rotated up to there or because I moved up to there? That's the bad thing about this. So you have to be kind of disciplined about using it. Okay? But the real thing is doing the matching. And so the algorithm for it, the set of steps you need to go through to do a transition from FK to IK or vice versa, is just you have to make sure that you've set the keys the same in both frames of reference. And that's not very complicated. We'll show you how to do it in just a sec. It just has to be done. And so you need to make sure that you've got a tool for your animators to do it with. Now, your package supposedly will let you do this, but your package is uniquely dumb about knowing how you've set this up. You've got your super leveraged foot control with 6 different alternative pivot arrangements, and it's nested 5 deep and constrained to the back of the elephant that you're standing on. Well, how the hell is the package going to be able to decipher that for you and know where to set that key? You can't really expect them to do it. So we have to do it ourselves. And the 2 basic ways you could do that are you could do it with a script that drives a hotkey, and then you say hotkey, and it just says copy this key over. Or you could do it with a callback if you're more of a script guy. You could set up a callback that watches certain blessed nodes and says, okay, take this guy, and now he's got a key on him, so copy the key over to the other guy. It's awkward. I don't like callbacks because they tend to Frankenstein on you, and they'll just run off and repeat themselves. They're not too much fun to work with, but it is powerful because it takes it out of the hands of the animator. It looks as transparent as the old biped arrangement did, where you could just set the IK, FK value and forget about it. And that was really beautiful. The only thing about biped that was really beautiful. But okay, so matching FK to IK is dog simple because it's called IK. All you need to do is get the rotational values out of the IK chain and pop them back into your FK controls. Now, the minor trick here is you got to remember to factor out whatever effect the IK to FK value that is set right now would have. Because there are going to be times when you want to set a key which is not just an I or an F, it's 50% of each. That's a thing that biped actually was really good at, was you'd be walking along and you'd have a hand that you were animating basically in FK. But if you were running rather than walking, and you just put, say, 10% of IK into that IK FK hand, you get a little bit more of that kind of punchy directional motion that you tend to do when you're running, and it was just totally free. You didn't have to set an extra key. So you may want to be doing that in this rig, and therefore you've got to be able to take out the parameter. Okay? Now the hard part is going the other way around, because the IK control could be in any number of different frames of reference. Also, it's two components. It's the control and the pull vector. The control itself, you use the same technique that we looked at way, way back at the beginning, and we called it faking there, right? You have a target that has all the same local characteristics as the IK that you want to control. So it's got the same rotational orientation. It's got the same local pivots. Presumably, it's in the same set of spaces. And the easy way to get that, of course, is to sort of actually, sorry, it's not in the same set of spaces. It's in the space of the FK. That's another thing I'm thinking of. So you have the target attached to the end of the arm or the leg. And you say, OK, well, I want the target to be here. So I'm going to constrain the target I need to match to this thing. And I know that because the local orientations were the same when I made it, I know because the pivot arrangements were the same when I made it, that the keys mean the same thing when I copy it over. So you just do the faking trick. You duplicate the control, constrain the duplicate, copy the key value back to the original control, and you're golden. Now the hard part is you got to do the pull vector as well. And this one, unfortunately, I'm not really aware of any decent way to get around the limitations I've listed up here. The chain has to be planar, because otherwise you don't really know what the relationship between a pull vector and the bones is supposed to be. If you've ever built a chain that isn't planar, you'll notice that that default pull vector location is not going to line up with the elbow. It'll be somewhere else. And so we can't compensate for that, unless at least I can't. So you got to have a planar chain. You have to have turned off the twist parameter, because again, figuring out how to counteract the value of the twist parameter to get the pull vector to go where it should is just, that's beyond me. That's a programmer question. The pull vector control has to be free to move in all three dimensions, because if you've locked it to the foot and given it only one dimension, it's a lot harder, because I have to somehow figure out how to get the one point on the line of that control which matches the plane of the rotate plane solver. And so with all those things, it's going to be tough. And even if you get it right, large twist changes in short amounts of time always run into big problems, because that's where the difference between interpolating between two rotations and between two positions, you know, here's my one guy and here's my other position for the pull vector, those things are very different. You know, they create different rotation over time. And so trying to overload that into the control is bad. However, whoops, go back. However, if you satisfy those conditions, it's not that hard. I mean, the simplest thing to do is simply snap the control to the middle joint, because the middle joint is always going to be on the rotate plane if it's a planar chain. That's a triangle, right? That's the simplest definition of the plane. Typically, that isn't the best thing to do, though, because if you do that and the arm is not in close, well, almost by definition, you've popped your pull vector very close to your IK vector, and therefore you're quite likely to cause it to flip, because if I'm here, I snap my control to there, and then I move there, I'm going to go whoop. So you don't want to do that. So what I'll usually do is I'll find that midpoint between the source and the target, get the vector between that and the elbow, because that is on the plane. I know that this line lies on that plane. And then I'll just extend it out by some arbitrary magic number to put the pull vector out of reach. So it's going to give me the position, and hopefully it'll be OK. That's about the best you can do, because it's not a linear translation anymore. That will usually work pretty well. OK, so to sum up, when we're talking about arms, arms ought to be simple, because now we know all about kinematics from the ground up. We know that that is an FK motion and that is an IK motion. Unfortunately, because arms are so multitasking, we also know that you almost always are going to have both in the same control. And so you need to have to worry about the switching systems, and you also need to be able to make sure that you can match those keys using the steps that we just outlined. So the big thing about arms is they benefit from a lot of forethought, because especially if you're going to have multiple controls, like you may need to have I've got a control in world space that allows me to pick stuff up off the table. I've got another control in the space of the lever over here that I want to pull on. And then I have a third control in the space of my body that is going to come with me as I walk up to pick things up off the table or pull on the lever. So I'm going to have a multi-stage switching system or a scheduler in order to be able to pick between all of these. So this we know, I think. We don't need to really repeat it. There are a couple of little subtleties about this, and I kind of just alluded to it. Where the IK controls live is, of course, very important. That's space analysis from day one there, from the very beginning. So if you have world space hands and you're doing a locomotion cycle, that's a mismatch because you're going to leave your hands behind. Everybody's had this happen to them once. Conversely, if you have body space hands and you're trying to deal with something on the table and you suddenly look away, well, your hand's going to do that. And so you should at least know where the expected range of action is going to take place and make sure that you've got at least one IK inside that space rather than trying to simulate it being in that space by hand animating it into there. Okay? There is a minor issue with the pole vectors that I alluded to before, that because the pole vector frame of reference really basically depends on whether you are under tight control or loose control. When you're tight, like a guy with a gun, then you want to have those controls up in the torso space because it forms a unit, and as you twist the torso around, you don't have the elbows moving. But if you're loose, then you do want the elbows to move. So if you're just kind of like letting your arms flop, then you'd want to have those torsos probably in the space of your body. That's not a perfect solution. Like you might want to say, put them in the space of a node at the average, like somewhere down in the middle of your thorax, something like that. There's a whole bunch of ways to do it. None of them are very good, unfortunately. I like the body space because the body space tends to be less mobile than any actual part of the body is, unless, of course, you're doing acrobatics. Okay? Now, I just put this slide in because it's so pretty and I couldn't bear to cut it. And because there are still a few people out there who build their skeletons without clavicles, which is biologically impossible and morally indefensible. When you get your elbow above the shoulder, after that point, you're getting twice as much clavicle as you are arm. So don't ever try it. That's all there is to it. If you're doing complicated deformation rigs, there's a whole bunch to be said about scapulas. I had an article in Game Developer about this back in the fall. But here's what I wanted to talk about in terms of a good special purpose rig. Now, obviously, this arrangement's only almost useless for anything else. But what it's really good for is the one very specialized case of trying to control a gun to aim at something. Now, if you did it the way poor Doug used to have to do it at Zipper, where his engine required him to just parent the gun to the hand, well, that's a huge pain because the hand is moving relative to the arm, not to the target. The gun is moving relative to the hand, not to the target. And in any case, they really should be relative to the place where the buttstock hits the shoulder, not to the hand or to the target. And so what we've got here is a pseudo-FK setup, like I mentioned a couple of slides back, where there's an extra node above that hand located up here where the buttstock hits the shoulder. It could or could not be the actual joint, the glenohumeral joint, if you wanted it to be. You could run that again if you want, Doug. And so that guy drives the hand drives the gun drives the other hand, but the whole thing is being driven by the target object, and then there's an aim constraint on the ball itself, on that shoulder ball there, that's making it follow. And so there's a whole lot of things going on in here that I didn't show. There's an Isner spine, there's a lot of weight shifting and whatever. And if I hadn't done all this, the gun would be woo-woo-woo like that. But this way, I get the aiming behavior for free. I didn't actually set any keys on that part at all. All I set keys on was the ball. And so, granted, there's a lot of times you're going to want to do more complicated stuff, but as an example of taking spaces, control groups in kinematics, and putting them all together into something that makes things simple, that's a good way to go. Okay, so quick review. We looked back at switching systems because switching systems are very central to ARMS. And then we talked about some of the ways in which all the various tasks that ARMS can do are going to require a bunch of hopping around between spaces, particularly between FK and IK. And that's sort of the big lesson of this set. Okay, so the last of our big headings, the last of the big five, is coordination. And by that I mean there are an awful lot of tasks in animation where you have a lot more joints to manage than you have information to convey. In a typical human skeleton, typical animation skeleton, 35% or something like that of the bones are your hands. If you got an 85 or 90 bone character, but with fully articulated finger, well, you've got 30 finger joints. And there's no way that you're conveying a third of all the information in the character with those joints. So we're going to look at different ways to follow the leader, different ways to sort of find simplicity out of that complexity. And there are a couple of very different routes you could do that with. So the first thing that I typically think of in this context, I used to work on all sorts of fancy arrangements with automatic hands and expressions and yada yada, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But as I've gotten older and more cynical, I've kind of come around to the feeling that a lot of times you just want to do it by example. I know what pointing looks like. I don't want to have to generate it by mathematics. I know what a wave looks like. I don't want to have to kind of figure out the sort of internal dynamics of it. But because typically pointing and waving are things that I do with a very simple arrangement in time, I point or I don't point, I don't typically care that much about the ins and outs of it. Well, maybe I just want to be able to slap a point into my scene whenever I need it. And for that, you use pose libraries. It's very simple. You're just storing a bunch of stuff and then slapping it back when you need it. So they're all going to follow the same general format. You're going to have the ability to save stuff. When you write this for yourself or find it on the net, you're always going to want to make sure that this includes the ability to set and store the keys on all the non-physical stuff as well as the physical stuff. It doesn't do you any good to recreate the positions of the controls if the little parameters and the switches that drive the meaning of those controls aren't preserved. So that's one thing you're going to think. You're also going to be able, of course, to slap them on. One of the really neat things that fall out of this, by the way, is that you can break people's sort of fetishistic obsession with the zero pose. Animators will pose and pose and pose and pose and get themselves into some hopelessly compromised position, and then they'll say, help, help, put me back in the bind pose. But the bind pose is only there for the person who did the skin. It doesn't say anything about the character. It doesn't help you in any way. It's just a useful frame of reference. Likewise, the setting my arm rotations to 0, 0, 0 means this? What is that relevant to? And so if you have a pose library, you can then discard those conventions because the sort of ball of string that leads you out of the maze is now the pose library rather than repurposing the skeleton for something it's not really good at. But anyway, you're going to need to be able to do all the obvious file management things. And one thing that's super duper powerful, of course, is the ability to transfer them between scenes. There's a bunch of good stuff for this out on the net. Doug and I had one at Zipper that was really fun. And this is a good candidate for scripting as well, because it's not actually very complicated. It's just do this, do that, do the other thing, call it a day. So it's a great way to get your feet wet if you're not already a big scripter. Now, of course, you'll probably be thinking, or at least some of you will, that this functionality is already included in the nonlinear editor in your package. And it is, which is both good and bad. NLEs are super duper powerful for certain kinds of tasks. They are, after all, basically a really nice, cool graphic interface to what I was describing before as a scheduler. If I wanted to have a timeline that said, footstep 1, now footstep 2, now footstep 6, well, it would be really nice to be able to have that, right? And actually, in Macs at least, it's all in one window, which is kind of pleasant. Unfortunately, the downside to these things is that they generally use a completely unrelated interface paradigm. And they also impose this management hassle where you have to be able to kind of describe your character in the terms that this thing chooses to understand. Maya's, in particular, is sort of beastly about making sure you tell it what the numbers are supposed to mean for each given little clip that you put in there. And it's just it's very, very powerful. Actually, Doug can tell you a great story about something we did with this at Zipper, but we haven't got time for it right yet. But the downside to it is that you're also just sort of taking the animator out of the scene and putting them into this other window that is not either the scene or the F-curve view. And it's just a whole bunch of stuff you've got to manage. So the one good thing about this, of course, is it also has built-in support for distributing stuff between scenes, which is great for building up a library, which is great for productivity. Okay? So let's just take this and apply it to fingers, or take this and the accumulated baggage of all the wisdom we've accumulated today and look at fingers. So, okay. Generally, the big thing about fingers, of course, is that they're just a pain to select. They're small, they're close together, and there's a lot of them. And so you're going to want to first look at how do you do an interface for that. The first two are pretty obvious, right? Everybody knows how the outliner works, and almost everybody has worked with some sort of GUI picker of some kind, whether it's HTML or a button window or something like that. Those are good, but if you're an interface book person, like if you've ever read Tog or Edward Tufte, you know that like you want to make a distinction between things you do a lot and things you do a little. And menu-like structures, hunt and peck structures like outliners or GUIs, are good for things you do at long intervals because you can forget about them in between. They're self-explanatory. On the other hand, things you do all the time or that you do in rapid succession, you want to be in muscle memory, not up here in intellectual memory. And so for that sort of thing, hotkeys and pickwalks are a far better tool because you can definitely get to things quickly and you can just sort of integrate it into the actual act of posing the character. I like to combine these two myself. I like to have a single hotkey that might pick out this finger and then use pickwalks to hop back and forth across the character so I can get to the finger I want. A lot of the time what you need to do is jigger around the selection in there to make sure that the pickwalk is relevant. You might have all sorts of other stuff inside the hand that you need to get rid of or to hide. But this is a really good way because it combines the relatively simple hotkey mechanism with the ability to get to lots of stuff, and you don't have to actually require people to memorize 10 keys. It's one key for maybe each hand, and then just a sort of series of combo hits. It's just like playing a game. The other thing you might need to do is selection proxies. Basically what will happen is if you can't reach into the mass of the fist to pick out that one joint on the pinky that you want, well, maybe what you do is you put a box in the scene but outside the hand that you can select the pinky with. Now, typically you'd want to use this where it's not a one-to-one. Like you may want to select the entire FK spine so you can rotate it all together. Or you may want to select the whole finger at one time. And then it's very easy. You just have a script that waits until you select the object in the script and then passes the selection along. And that way you have basically an in-scene handle, which is a lot more efficient than going out to another window. Of course, the bad side is it's a callback, and you know I hate callbacks. Now, all that being said, a lot of times it's just easier to drive these things automatically. You know, the number of cases where you really care about precise finger location is pretty small. More often than not, you want general gestures, loosely arranged, and it's secondary animation material. It's not deeply embedded in the character. So for that's a good example of where you might want to use a synthetic control to achieve coordination, like we said way back at the beginning. So I've just found kind of experimentally that, you know, all you really need is 3 parameters to drive it. 3 parameters maps very neatly onto space. And so it's really straightforward to get what you want with just 1 control per finger as opposed to 3 controls per finger. You don't have to do extra selection overhead. Obviously, you're not going to be able to play a piano with that arrangement, but it works really well for most kind of general purpose. You know, everything I've done up here today could be easily represented that way. On the other hand, maybe sometimes you do care about fingers, in which case you might want to think about IKing them. Now, you probably don't want to IK the fingers of your walk cycle, but of your typing animation or, you know, following a line of script on a surface or something like that, or pushing buttons, well, there maybe you do want to use it. Actually, I used FK for that. Another story. But I did use it for grasping, and the other hand is using them as well. And you can't see it very well in this shot, but she's actually kind of dragging her fingers across it a lot of the time. You're using it to maintain contact, and that's one of the jobs that IK does. Now, the downside to that, of course, is you're going to still have a 1 control per finger. You'll also have to worry about where's that rotate plane. And so if the hand's moving around a lot, it might be problematic. You might need to have a control that grouped all of the rotate planes together and let you keep them in the same space as the hand, so you didn't have to constantly micromanage the rotation of the fingers. Okay, so the short story about coordination is it's intended for dealing with stuff either that you don't care about as much, but that takes up a lot of attention, fingers, or for stuff where the interface is very complicated, but the basic mechanism happens slowly, like faces. You know, you'll set a lot of keys in the course of setting your heel down, but unless you're really doing a performance where you're really analyzing every fraction of a second, most of the time when you deal with faces, you're kind of going from a smile to a frown to a whatever on a much longer time scale. And so for that kind of thing, you might want to use a pose library on top of the typical arrangement with a set of blend shapes or a bunch of bones. Particularly if you are using bone-based facial, pose libraries are really good because Otherwise, you don't have an abstraction that lets you say what's a smile and what's a frown and what's a yell. Okay? So we've kind of run through the gamut of the things that we wanted to touch on in terms of theoretical concepts, right? We've got the 5 big things. We've got spaces, which is all about where stuff happens. We've got kinematics, which is how it happens inside the space. We've got control groups, which are sort of ways of manipulating the behavior of our tools inside a space. Switches for handing off control from different mechanisms. And lastly, we've got coordination. So we can take all of these and put them together and apply them to a practical topic, which is heads. Except for coordination. Because coordination plus heads equals facial, which equals more slides, which equals time we don't have. So we'll kind of take that as read. I saw some people nod when I said, pose, libraries, and faces. I'll take that as enough. So with heads, the choices are really similar to the choices you have for torsos. You've got the choice between expression and sort of positional maintenance. So you might tend to think about IK as a head thing, but as we said in the Jaguar example, a lot of what your body is doing is devoted precisely to controlling the position of your head in space. And so if you're getting punched, well, that's an FK-ish sort of thing. Sorry about the yell there. Whereas if you're running or walking, your body's doing all sorts of cute stuff intended to keep your head where it is, or as close as possible as you can. And so the FK-based rigs are good for expression, and the IK-based rigs are good for, they're good for expression, for performance, like the very fine kind of modulation of gaze that I'm giving this guy here in the second row. That's a really nice thing to achieve with FK, FK control of the rotation of my head, whereas the positional thing that you happen when you have violent motion and you're running around is a very IK-ish sort of thing. So here's a really simple example of the sort of space things we talked about right back at the beginning. I'm using FK to look at all of you. I'm not tracking anybody, but what I am doing is orienting my head to the space of this room, not to the space of my body. And so this is just a really simple way of taking the control of my head out of the body space and putting it in the world. So it's glued to my body by a point constraint, but it lives in the world, and then it, in turn, constrains the actual head. And that's exactly what you want under most circumstances for somebody doing what I'm doing. I'm orienting myself to the world, and unless I do something like that, I don't really care about the relationship between my head and my body until it reaches the breaking point. Sorry. Okay? Now, on top of the head, you have to worry about the neck, and that's where the spine stuff we were talking about comes in. So as you can see, this is exactly the same as the Isner arrangement. Depending on the nature of the character, you might be able to get away with no control at the base at all. You may just want to have that base fixed to the torso, treat the head as something you just sort of pull around through the world. If you need more expressive control, you'll probably want to have independent movement at the bottom so you can kind of fold the neck down. It's not biologically accurate, but a lot of times you need it anyway. And then you do the same thing with the twist, taking the twist out of the neck that you would do when taking the twist out of the torso. Either, in this case, you're using the Isner's ability to take the twist out. Otherwise, you're using the 2+1 FK in the neck. Now, the good thing about this setup is it gives you a lot of automatic counter. And I realize that we actually do have an example of this, which is the Egyptian thing. This was from an earlier version of the talk, and it was actually illustrating a different principle. But if you watch what the heads are doing, they're doing this kind of chicken move, right? And the whole thing is coordinated by actually a spline that runs all the way up from the bottom. It's sort of like a two-part spline, because I wanted to get that very whoop kind of motion in there. And so there's just no way you could achieve this with an FK control. It's a perfect example of IK. And it's sort of the acting inverse of what you would do if you were doing like a sports kind of thing, where the guy's running and he's doing all sorts of crazy stuff, but his head is staying in control so that he can navigate through the world and react. Okay? Now, of course, a lot of people like to use targets for heads. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this because, as I said before, you tend to track about the whole world, big zones of the world, rather than little pieces of the world. But there is the Wimbledon case where you're watching the tennis ball. You want to be able to do that. And this would be an application of the switching arrangements. Presumably, you would want to combine this with something else because, if you remember the pole vector example, using a translation to drive a rotation means you get all sorts of weird keyscope problems. I want to look from this gentleman over here, this lady over here. Well, Okay, in that case, it makes sense. But if they were right here, I'd have this control way up there going around like this, when in fact it's really just a rotation. And so this kind of arrangement is great for the limited purpose of tracking. We're also leveraging the pole vector to make it explicit how we're controlling the roll of the head instead of sort of relying on IK magic or aim constraint magic to do it. And then you just need a switch to turn it on and off when you want it. Okay? So to review really quickly, we looked at the heads in the context of all the stuff we saw before. And basically, the lessons still apply. You have to think about your spaces, think about your kinematics. You have to be able to hand control from things back and forth with switches. And more often than not, you also have to think really carefully about coordination in the form of phases. We just didn't talk about it here. Okay. So that actually concludes the sort of like techie component of this. But I do want to end on a slightly different note. I said at the beginning of this that I was thinking about this in terms of the way Hollywood works. Not in the sense that they have super-duper production values and we should all be ashamed before them, which is the usual theme of GDC. Rather, in the sense that if you grow up through a craft profession in Hollywood, if you're a gaffer or an electrician or a Foley artist or not so much an animator, but not so much a CG animator, but a hand animator, you go up through a group of people who share a bunch of knowledge and who have a sort of socialization into a way of looking at the world, something we could really use in this business. And so part of that is learning to think about yourself as a professional, right? We have to be able to look at the people who write our paychecks and say, I have a bunch of valuable skills that you need, and I can provide you a valuable commodity. And so part of that is thinking about it in professional terms, right? Not just thinking about the brilliance of your solution to this tricky problem of my rig allows you to drag the pinky across the top of the Rolls Royce in exactly the right way. No, what you want to be thinking about is, can you hand it off to a bunch of animators who don't necessarily work that closely with you or with each other and have them all be able to work with it pretty straightforwardly? Naming conventions, clean organization of the outliner, all sorts of really boring, crappy stuff without which your genius is almost for nothing. Okay? I want to point out, by the way, great references for interface design stuff. I didn't talk about interface today because it's not directly in line. It is super critical to doing a good job. However, it's also a great theological thing which would get people yelling and screaming, and I didn't want to have anybody yell at me today. Okay? And then the last thing is just quality control. And for quality control, the magic bullet really is automation. If you're not trying to do this stuff with script, you should at least be considering it really carefully, because in the script, you only have to worry about the typo once. If you're doing it all by hand, you have to worry about the typo every time you start from scratch. In a script, you only have to worry about designing the folder organization where you're hiding all of the little nuggets that you don't want the animators to play with once. Otherwise, you have to do it from scratch every time. And so these are great ways for enforcing quality. They're great ways for encoding information, because you're never going to document this stuff if you have to type it out every time. But it's not that hard to write the comment once and then have the little node that pops up and says, use this control for this and not for that. Really good way to get your animators on board with what you're actually asking them to do. And so you want to build stuff as a library of components. I've been advocating all along that there's a sort of mix and match thing where some stuff works good for some jobs and not for others. Well, don't try to build the rig that enfolds it all under 10 layers of different controls. Build 10 rigs, or better yet, build 10 components that you could snap onto a rig just by saying, give me FK feet, an IK FK right arm, and a left arm with just a body space IK, because I know I'm going to have to be running along with this thing on my back. That would be great. And that would be great because you could pass it off to the animators, and it's a tool that helps teach them to try to think about these things the way we're talking about them, rather than just thinking, oh, God, I think I'll just set one key per frame for all 85 frames of this animation. And then when they go bad, I'll go back and reset them all. Right? That's what a lot of animators will do if you don't help them see what a huge force multiplier all this stuff is. Okay, the last thing I want to say, and this is just what we started out with, is that none of this stuff is gospel. None of this stuff is perfect. It's all intended to get you guys talking back to us and to each other. And I'd really, really like it if the net result of this was not that everybody thought how clever I was, but that everybody thought, gee, he didn't know what the hell he was talking about, but I do, and I'm going to get this out. I'm going to get this information out to other people so they're not deluded by that fool. And so for that reason, Doug, The slides are up already. I put them up before I came down here, back at giantbyte.com, and there's a forum there, and I'd love it if people could, in addition to giving us questions and stuff up here, if people could, pursue some of this stuff there. I don't know if you guys heard it at the break, but Doug and I were saying that maybe for next year, what would be a lot of fun would be to collect people's kind of little nuggets. I deliberately went for the boring, least common denominator stuff this year, but it would be really fun for people to collect the stuff they're really super proud of. The time you made the guy with the hair that was simulated with physics, and he was leaning on the sphere, and it really looked like he was, all that stuff is great, and when it's not in this format, it would be great to be able to share it. And so that's something to think about too, showcasing your work. If you look at it this way, you can almost always tell a good modeler because they know about spiraloid.com, or actually that's not the URL for it. But most really great modelers find out about that at some point because it's the best collection of information about that topic. If we had something like that for us, well, we'd be in a big, better position. We'd be able to teach ourselves and teach each other. So that's what I'd like to leave you with. Thanks very much, and now we'll take questions.